The Western model fails because it refuses to understand that the human mind is tribal. You believe that democracy creates peace. You believe that if you give people individual liberty, free speech, and the right to vote, society will naturally balance itself and prosper. You are wrong. When you drop universal voting into an unintegrated, multi-ethnic society, you do not get a stable parliament. You get tribal warfare. You get ethnic blood on the streets. You get destruction. Kuan, you understood this 60 years before modern political analysts began to panic about polarization. He looked at human nature without romance, without pity, and without ideological fairy tales. He was a wicked genius because he discarded every modern sacred cow to build an enduring machine of statecraft. Most people study history. You admire Alexander because he crossed deserts and conquered Persia. You admire Napoleon because he outmaneuvered Austrian field marshals at Austerlitz. But what happened to Alexander's empire the moment he died in Babylon? His generals tore it to pieces within months. What happened to Napoleon's grand empire? He died in exile on a rock in the South Atlantic, and France was left smaller and poorer than he found it. These men were brilliant battlefield tacticians, but they were catastrophic state builders. Only two men in recorded history mastered the deepest law of statecraft, transforming a dying, fractured territory into a self-sustaining institutional engine that outlived them. The first was Caesar Augustus, who took a rotting Roman Republic and forged an administrative principate that endured for centuries. The second was Kuan Yew. To understand his strategy, you must first unlearn the standard lie about national success. You assume that rich nations become rich because they have oil, gold, arable soil, or vast armies. You look at Singapore today, gleaming glass towers, the highest concentration of millionaires on earth. Sovereign wealth funds holding hundreds of billions, and you assume it was an inevitable trade hub. Ask yourself this: how does a flat, malaria-ridden swamp with zero natural resources, no drinking water, no army, and 3 million illiterate refugees survive when it is kicked out of its parent federation and surrounded by hostile neighbors with millions of troops? In August 1965, Malaysia expelled Singapore. They threw the island into the sea to drown. Lee sat in front of the television cameras and wept openly. That was the last time he showed weakness. The moment the red camera light turned off, he locked the doors and started calculating survival physics. He had no domestic market. He had no defense. He had racial riots burning down city blocks between Chinese, Malay, and Indian factions. The Western playbook said, hold elections, let the market settle itself, and appeal to the United Nations for food aid. Lee did the opposite. He recognized the first law of power. When you have no leverage, you do not beg. You make yourself indispensable to the most ruthless forces in the global economy. He skipped the entire region. He did not waste time trading with hostile neighbors who wanted to swallow him. He reached thousands of miles across the ocean directly to American and European multinational corporations. At that time, Third World leaders considered multinational corporations evil colonial exploiters. Lee recognized them as lifeboats. He offered them zero corruption, 24-hour port turnaround, and absolute labor peace. If a union attempted a wildcat strike that threatened port operations, Lee crushed the strike without hesitation. He told the labor leaders directly that if they stopped the docks, the country would starve, and he would not permit them to starve 3 million people for the sake of ideological purity. He took away their right to disrupt the machine, and in return, he gave their children modern housing, world-class schools, and secure jobs. The foreign capital flooded in. Singapore did not build an economy on foreign aid. It built an economy by becoming the most efficient, low-friction operating system for global capital on Earth. Now look at the internal problem. This is where his wicked genius moves from economics to social architecture. You think that different ethnic groups learn to live together when you teach tolerance in school and run public service campaigns. You believe diversity naturally harmonizes if people are polite. Li knew that was a fantasy. Left to their own choices, human beings self-segregate. The Chinese will live in Chinese enclaves. The Malays will cluster in Malay villages. The Indians will concentrate in Indian quarters. And the moment economic stress hits, each tribe will blame the other, listen to demagogues, pick up machetes, and burn the city down. Li did not ask his citizens to be tolerant. He forced the physical geometry of their lives to integrate. He launched the Housing and Development Board. The government bought the land, demolished the squalid ethnic slums, and built massive, clean high-rise concrete estates. Then he instituted the ethnic integration policy. Every single apartment building and every single floor had a strict racial quota that mirrored the national demographic. Roughly 74% Chinese, 13% Malay, 9% Indian. If you were Chinese and wanted to sell your flat, you could not sell it to the highest bidder. If that bidder was Chinese and the building had reached its quota, you were legally required to sell only to a Malay or an Indian buyer. Consider the sheer audacity of this mechanism. Li stripped away the free market right of property sale to kill tribal segregation at the root. Why? Because when children ride the same elevator every morning, play on the same concrete courtyards, and smell their neighbors cooking every evening, the primal fear of the outsider dissolves. You cannot easily demonize a group when your child does homework with their child every afternoon. He engineered peace, not through moral lectures, but through concrete and urban quotas. Next, examine his military deterrence doctrine. You think a small, rich city-state must choose a patron empire and accept vassal status to avoid invasion. You assume that weakness must invite subservience. How did Li stop hostile regional powers from rolling tanks across the causeway and seizing the Deepwater Harbor? He built what he called the poison shrimp strategy. When Singapore was cast out, it had 2 infantry battalions, led mostly by foreign officers. Li secretly brought in Israeli military commanders, codenamed Mexicans, so the Muslim populations in Southeast Asia would not discover them to build a national defense architecture from the ground up. He instituted mandatory universal conscription. Every single male citizen, regardless of wealth or family name, was drafted at 18 and trained as a combat soldier. The strategic message to every neighbor was brutally simple. You have more soldiers than us. You can defeat us. But we are a poison shrimp. If you swallow us, you will die of internal hemorrhage before you can digest us. We will destroy your infrastructure, wipe out your air assets, and ruin your economy before you take this island. Later, as the Singapore Armed Forces grew into the most technologically advanced military force in the region, he updated the doctrine from the poison shrimp to the porcupine and the dolphin, a state that is impossible to touch without suffering catastrophic pain, yet fast and agile enough to maneuver between great power rivalries. He made Singapore so heavily armed that peace became the only rational option for everyone around him. Then came the eccentric levers, the policies Western intellectuals mocked as authoritarian absurdity. You think statecraft is only about writing constitutions, setting interest rates, and signing international treaties. You think a prime minister should not care about chewing gum, public spitting, flushing toilets, or who marries whom. Why did Lee Kuan Yew ban chewing gum? Why did he impose mandatory caning for vandalism? Why did he institute state-run matchmaking agencies for university graduates? Look at the underlying system. In the late 1980s, Singapore spent billions of dollars constructing an advanced, fully automated underground railway system, the Mass Rapid Transit. Vandals began sticking used chewing gum over the optical sensors on the train doors. The sensors failed. The automated trains stopped. Millions of work hours were lost, and the transit grid choked. A Western leader would launch an awareness campaign, hire more cleaning staff, and accept a 2% efficiency loss. Lee banned the import and sale of chewing gum overnight. He did not care if international newspapers called him a micromanaging tyrant. The train doors closed on the exact second. The workers arrived at their desks on time. The multi-billion-dollar infrastructure performed at peak efficiency. He understood that modern civilization is an extremely fragile engineering marvel. It is sustained entirely by micro habits. If you allow people to spit on the sidewalk, litter in the streets, and break public assets without physical consequences, the social contract decays. Broken windows produce broken institutions. When an American or European corporate executive stepped off the airplane at Changi Airport, saw clean streets, perfectly functioning logistics, zero graffiti, and police officers who could not be bribed with $1 million, that executive did not see tyranny. That executive saw total operational reliability. They invested billions of dollars because Lee made Singapore the only place in the developing world where chaos was illegal. He applied that same icy structural logic to human genetics and family policy. In the 1980s, he noticed that highly educated women were remaining single while uneducated women were having large families. He publicly sounded the alarm, arguing that the nation's talent pool would degrade over generations if the brightest minds did not reproduce. He created the Social Development Uniter state agency that organized cruises, dinners, and events specifically to match university graduates with each other. He gave tax breaks to educated mothers. The Western press was horrified. They called it eugenics. Lee did not care about their outrage. He cared about the demographic distribution of intelligence 50 years into the future. He looked at statecraft not as a popularity contest, but as the systematic management of human capability. This brings us to the ultimate metric of leadership: succession. This is where the difference between an ordinary strongman and an architect of history becomes absolute. Every ordinary dictator concentrates power in his own hands. He creates a cult of personality. He eliminates all capable men around him because he fears rivals. The moment he grows old or dies, his regime fractures into civil war or collapses under the weight of incompetent sycophants. Look at the dictators of the 20th century. Their monuments crumbled while their bodies were still warm. Kuan did the opposite. He did not build a regime around his personality. He built an unyielding, incorruptible meritocracy. He paid government ministers the highest salaries on earth matching. Private sector executive paid to eliminate the temptation of bribery and to attract the sharpest analytical minds away from global banks and law firms. If a minister accepted a single illegal dollar, Lee had the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau arrest him, ruin him, and jail him, regardless of whether he was a lifelong friend. He showed no mercy to his inner circle. Then, when he was at the height of his international prestige and domestic power, he did what almost no great ruler in history has ever done. He steps down. He handed the Prime Minister's office to a younger generation of leaders he had spent 2 decades testing, vetting, and training. He remained in the cabinet as a senior advisor, watched the machine run, corrected course when necessary, and allowed the new leadership to govern. When Kuan died in 2015, the state did not panic. The currency did not crash. The stock market did not wobble. The military did not leave its barracks. The buses ran on time. The port cleared hundreds of thousands of shipping containers, and the ethnic quotas held firm. The machine he built did not need him to survive. That is the difference between a conqueror and an architect. Alexander left an empire of bones and chaos. Napoleon left a defeated nation. Kuan took a swamp with no resources, mastered the brutal mechanics of power and human nature, defied the romantic illusions of the West, and built an enduring civilization that will outlast his critics. You may dislike his methods, you may call him ruthless, but if you want to understand real power, real leverage, and the cold science of enduring statecraft, you must study the mind of Kuan.